Welcome back, loyal viewers of the History of the Meta series. Rainey and I are here with SuperMagicalCup for episode 8.
Episode 8, we've come a long way for History of the Meta. Since the beginning, the game has finally launched, and History of the Meta 8 is talking about the March 23rd changes, the first balance update after the game has released. You'll find that Supercell is making balance changes much less frequently. I think about maybe a monthly
About monthly. We were getting away from late beta where there was an update, it seemed like every 10 days or 2 weeks, and moving to much more monthly changes, and that means that each balance update is much more intentional with a design to change the known meta as opposed to just fix broken cards, and the lists are huge. This is the biggest balance update, I believe, up to this point of the game ever in terms of the sheer number of cards affected.
And also something interesting to note is because the game is globally released, players are playing this game like crazy.
Oh, the player base grew by a factor of 10, right? It felt like exponential growth. So what people thought they knew about the meta or thought they knew about good decks were getting upended around this time, and Supercell wanted to step in and not just adjust existing cards, but of course, 6 new cards were released a month ago. And they wanted to make sure to go in and tweak those changes, making some a little less powerful and some a little more powerful. But let's get into it.
So make sure to follow our channels there for Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube to watch more videos on best decks, SMC TV, and if you want to watch the tournaments that we run, you can watch them live at Twitch and the VOD on YouTube, live at Twitch Saturday, 12 p.m. PST. So make sure you're tuning in to watch the best competitive Clash Royale tournament in the world.
So what I remember about the meta at this time was Mortar was really popular. I mean, we talked about a little bit in the last episode where Giant and Golem were really the only tanks that you saw, but Siege was still sort of the dominant archetype. Mortar was all over the place. I remember, though, an Expo deck was starting to come back. Expo had kind of fallen out of favor in favor of Mortar, but people figured out that you could put an Expo with a Tesla tower in front of it because there was exactly 2 squares, and Expo started to come back. So that's one thing that gets changed in this update was sort of Expo, no matter what they did, kept coming back into the meta, and I think Clash Royale, the Supercell team, realized, like, we've got to get rid of Expo, and we sort of see the death blow in these balance updates.
Yeah. The Tesla and the Expo was just brutal just to counter because no matter what they did was just to... Some people that always play those siege decks could always guard it by not even putting a troop out there, and it was just annoying. That's all it was.
And one of the big changes that they throw in is reducing the Tesla's duration in this update that we're going to see a little bit later. And as Rumham and I always like to talk about, these towers are really, really hard to kill. They always went through iteration and iteration and iteration, and finally they tapped out and we're like, okay, we're going to reduce the duration. And then we'll see that the tower swaps out for the next one in line. And it's really interesting to see how Supercell is having to fight against the Siege meta right now.
Yeah, and it's not even that. I mean, just the Tesla was also decreased, and also was the cannon. The cannon was being used. It was such good value for 3 elixir. You get 40 seconds, and then and then they take 10 seconds off in this update, and it kind of saw less gameplay with the cannon.
Well, that was like the Mortar deck, right? The Mortar deck was like Tesla, Cannon, Mortar. Like you ran so many defensive towers because they could all defend the Mortar very well.
Yeah, then you add an Inferno in there, and then you got a Woody deck. I'm just kidding, Woody.
So, since Global Update, that patch, added legendaries to the game. What was your first impression of legendaries in the game?
Legendaries. My first instinct and thoughts were, man, I'm never going to get one because they seemed to be impossible to get because they had introduced the Super Magical chests.
Right.
Which...
There's only 2 legendaries at the time, too. It's just Princess and Ice Wizard. So, even if you got one, there was a pretty small selection of which ones you were going to get.
Yes, exactly. And I remember when I got mine, because I had to buy, I think, 4 Super Magical chests, and that was like, man, I got 1 Ice Wiz. Man, I'm a winner. And so I built every deck around that, and they were really, truly overpowered for what you got out of them. I mean, Ice Wiz still today is kind of overpowered, but
it's worth mentioning too that the tournament cap at the time was 1368. So now level 1 legendaries fight against level 9 commons. At release, Princess was fighting level 8 commons, which means that arrows didn't kill her at the time. Like we see they make a few changes to make it a little more balanced, but from the very first day that Princess was launched, I felt that card was just like over the top. It was like just so cartoonishly good.
That was the one card I always wanted, like right when the legendaries came out, was Princess, just because of the range. Mm-hmm. It could guard against anything, and plus, I mean, at that time I was like a level 8, level 9, so I mean, arrows at that time could not kill the Princess, and it was just annoying just to play against the Princess because you actually had to have troops to take out the Princess, and then they would just take out your troops, and
without arrows, there's no even elixir trade.
No, it's like, oh man, I'm gonna spend these barbs to take out that Princess. Oh yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah, I think ever since the legendaries were introduced, Supercell had to wrestle with a new problem that they didn't really have in the game about how they were going to balance the rarity versus the power versus the effectiveness, and in which decks that these cards would really be implemented in. And so the Ice Wizard and Princess was kind of the beginning of a long struggle that they still have struggles with to try to figure out how they fit into the game.
Aside from the Mortar deck, there was I would say Mortar was probably one of the first dominant archetypes in the game's history, but there was a bigger bully, a bigger boogeyman starting to brew. It took a little bit for the deck to get finalized into its solid 8-card list, but the deck was so powerful that it was called the OP deck, the overpowered deck. And it was, let's see if we can remember off the top of our head. P.E.K.K.A, Prince, Dark Prince, Ice Wizard, Princess, Freeze, Elixir Collector, and Arrows, I think?
Arrows, yeah.
Because you had to kill the minion horde.
Yeah, you had to kill the minion horde.
But I remember that deck was so nuts. The Double Prince was picked up pretty much from the first day of global launch. People saw the clear synergy between Prince and Dark Prince. But very quickly, combining it with P.E.K.K.A created the strongest, most overwhelming, most unstoppable 3-crown deck the game had ever seen to this point.
Oh yeah, it was really hard to counter. I mean, it was just tough because no matter what, they had to counter for you.
Whether you couldn't play things like barbs, they freeze them, right?
They freeze them, and then the Dark Prince would take out your barbs, and then the Prince would have a free run. I mean, because you're trying to take out the big P.E.K.K.A, and then they have the Prince in the back that's just taking out your small troops in the back. It was just annoying.
And it's worth mentioning that Freeze was better then, it gets nerfed later on. So Freeze had a base duration of 5 seconds at the time and scaled up to like 7.8 or something like that.
Yeah, it was close to 8 seconds.
Yeah.
So if you're playing like a good max deck and you're like a lower level, it was like, oh cool man, there's like 1/20th of the match unfrozen. So
it was pretty nuts. And I remember though that deck was exacerbated by that there were level 8 epics, which is what we have today, but commons only went up to level 12 and rares only went up to level 10.
Yes.
The problem was that tournament cap was epics were 5 levels below commons, so it's like level 3 epics to level 5 commons, but there was only a 4-level difference between them at the very top of the ladder. So what people saw on TV Royale, which is only top 50 players at the time, and that's what the meta is, was very epic-centric because a 1 level higher P.E.K.K.A one-hit barbarians at max level, but didn't do it at tournament cap. Prince would charge and one-hit barbarians. It was crazy because that deck, in tournaments you could counter it, as we saw in the Helsinki tournament a few weeks later. Like you could counter that deck in tournaments, but at the ladder you couldn't. And the only way anyone knew what was good in the game was TV Royale, where everyone had level 8 epics. So there was a really weird tension between tournament play and ladder play that allowed the OP deck to really be like almost everything in TV Royale at the time.
Yeah, I mean, everybody you saw played it. You saw at least, once every 4 hours was a replay of an OP deck, some sort of version of it.
Sometimes mirror matches.
Yeah, and then that's all you learn from that. And then you play on the ladder, and then you try to do it with your level troops.
Like level 2 P.E.K.K.A.
Oh, yeah. No, they're nowhere near as strong or as powerful as,
Yeah. I remember the other deck that HK Esports was the big guild at the time. That was like the one, they were top of the ladder. They had a lot of really top ladder players. They would come up with all sorts of wacky decks, and almost all of them were epic centric. And it only was at the Helsinki tournament that they start to realize, like, oh no, like maybe these decks don't work as well. Because I remember there was one that was like Witch, Balloon, P.E.K.K.A, Rage, something else. There's 5 epics in the deck. Like, it was 5 epics and 3 non-epics. And, I mean, it was really crazy to see what people thought the meta was going to be and then what the actual competitive meta evolved into with the Helsinki tournament and then later the addition of the tournament feature.
Yeah, in many ways, since the game's launch, leading up to the Helsinki tournament, everything was focused on ladder play because that's really what existed. Despite the fact that they did have tournament caps and tournament rules, that was only in the realm of friendly battles, and everybody just figured that, well, friendly battles are great, but what really works for me is what works on ladder, and I see the OP deck everywhere. So until the Helsinki tournament happened, the player base was largely focused on this epic-based game.
So we mentioned in the last update that every single one of the new cards that got introduced weren't exactly right. They all get a little series of buffs and tweaks. Clark Kent, what was your first impression of the new cards at global launch?
At global launch, well, I mean, in theory, I thought, the 3 Musketeers is cool because, you get 3 cards, three troops for the cost of,
A 12 elixir for 10 is still a +2 elixir trade.
Yeah.
Don't get fireballed.
But heck, to get him up that high and then to fireball, you lose 5 elixir off that, or 6 elixir. And then
people hadn't really considered that splitting was really a thing either. Like, you see nowadays the splitting of 3 Musketeers as the basis of a deck, but then people were just trying to put them behind like P.E.K.K.A.s and things like that.
Yes, yeah. And then plus you had to save up actually for 10 elixir, then you had nothing to counter if you dropped it. So at least now when they dropped it to 9, I mean, you actually had a little bit of a basis to have a chance to drop skeletons or something for some sort of counter. But then the other one that I really remember was the Royal Giant, and that thing was just
unreal bad.
It was so bad. I tried to make it work, and no, I just gave up real quick on it. It was just the range was bad, the damage was bad, the health was bad. It was like, man,
I liked it mechanically too. Like, I distinctly remember defending people like Royal Giant sucks. And I'm like, you know what? Mechanically, the card is fine. Like, a tanky long-range siege thing is cool. It just needs the right change in order to be good, and I didn't know how right I was going to be, right? Like, I didn't really plan that. But I remember that, there would be times where if somebody played a Royal Giant, they were a hero. They were like, wow, what a cool dude.
He was kind of considered the hipster of Clash Royale.
Oh, you're going to be the different person who plays a Royal Giant. Yeah. Royal Giant goes through 3 separate massive buffs that, individually are some of the top largest buffs ever given to a single card. It gets 3 of them before becoming the Royal Giant we know today, and then gets nerfed a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll see more of the Royal Giant in the meta and its terribleness, especially in Helsinki, where it does have that hero
that's right. The crowd went wild when Clash with Ash played a Royal Giant against a Mortar. People were like, there are heroes here to save us. We have 100% confidence. We'll never hate this card.
Oh, ignorance is bliss.
Right. So this balance update opens up, this is the first one after global launch, so really it's Supercell talking to a whole new group of players, and they restate the common principle we've heard, offense over defense. Offense should be better than defense. And the first change targets that pesky Expo. Expo has been nerfed probably more than any other card during beta, and the funny thing was, after the last update, with the deploy time going up to 5 seconds, it actually did fall out of favor for a little bit, but it came back yet one more time, like Swamp Thing from the depths. Like, you just couldn't keep it down. The most recent Expo deck that caused this nerf, and the reason why they specifically targeted range as opposed to deploy time, damage, anything else, was the range of 13 allowed the Expo 2 spots away from the river. And in those 2 spots, can't fit a cannon because it's 3x3, can't fit an Inferno Tower because it's 3 spaces by 3 spaces, but you could fit a 2 square by 2 square Tesla Tower with exactly enough range to hit the enemy tower. This was made worse by Tesla Tower being, well, the best tower in the game at the time. So while Tesla takes a huge nerf as well, they wanted to make sure that no matter how good or bad Expo or Tesla was, you didn't have the ability to put a tower directly in front of a siege weapon. They wanted to make sure that if you were going to play a siege weapon, the danger was that people could walk up and attack it. You had to defend it with troops and spells. You couldn't just jam more towers in front of it. So we see Expo get pulled 1 space closer to the river, and this I know we've said it a bunch of times, but this was truly the update that made X-Bow go away, go into a long hibernation for probably about 5 months, 4 to 5 months before really resurfacing in the tournament meta.
Yeah. Tesla Tower was being used everywhere. It was the go-to defensive tower. We talked about how all these towers got their duration reduced, and then the next tower up to bat just became the new powerful defensive structure. Tesla was a current one, and with what we talked about with the X-Bow and the Tesla and being able to put it in front to defend your X-Bow, Supercell really wanted to figure out a way to make the Tesla much more in line with what they imagined defensive structures would be. Very interesting, because you see in the text that it notes that the win rates and the use rates didn't really reflect the tower being overpowered, so to speak, but they really just wanted to make sure that it had strong weaknesses or really significant weaknesses to it, and it wasn't an elixir investment that you could just put down and guarantee some kind of benefit off of. So they reduced the duration that it exists, and they also reduced its hit speed, which I think comes down to about kind of like a 12% DPS reduction or so. So they were really looking to make sure that Tesla wasn't just a go-to card to pick and guarantee that your defensive needs are all satisfied. But of course, as we keep mentioning, this is just another tower in the line of tons of towers that players will continually pick up and use.
Yeah, it's not listed in this balance update, but as soon as this hit, it was Bomb Tower's turn. So Inferno Tower had a 60-second lifespan. Too good. Nerf the lifespan down to 40 seconds. Tesla gets played in every deck. Tesla gets nerfed right here for 40 seconds. From this until the next balance update, boy, is it Bomb Tower's time to shine.
Yeah.
This update was interesting, though, because besides the lifetime, which I think was probably the most needed change, the reduction in hit speed allowed you to swarm it easier. If you actually look at the old videos, Tesla Tower attacks pretty fast. Like, you can kind of tell the difference between 0.7 seconds and 0.8 seconds when you actually see it in action. It made it so that you couldn't play swarmy troops to kill the Tesla, but now something like a minion horde would overwhelm it pretty quickly. Cannon also saw a lifetime reduction. It's funny, all the other towers are 40 seconds now, with the exception of Bomb Tower. Yeah. Cannon, though, got reduced to 30 seconds, probably because it's the cheapest of them, right? It's only 3 cost. But what's crazy about Cannon is that while we've talked about Inferno, Tesla, whatever, Cannon might have been the dark horse best defensive tower this entire time. Right after getting reduced to 3 cost, it suffers multiple lifetime damage, health, maybe not damage, but definitely hit point reductions. Even though the lifetime gets reduced here, I believe we see Cannon take a hit point reduction over the next 2 or 3 balance updates in a row. It's pretty significant. This was just another offense over defense change. Like all Cannon nerfs, this one was not received very well. People were like, oh no, Hog Riders are going to dominate. Hog Riders are going to beat us forever. But Cannon remained very popular and remained so even through the future nerfs as well.
And really, it's interesting because there was videos made about Hog Riders and their effectiveness against a Cannon, and really these nerfs didn't actually make the Hog Rider any more effective. The
Cannon was meant to die in the first place, right? Like, it's meant to just die and kill that Hog Rider. Whether or not it survives with 10 seconds or 5 seconds left kind of was irrelevant.
The next nerf, probably a very obvious and very needed nerf. Princess, as we mentioned, when it first released, was not killable by arrows. And so it was basically this long-range mortar card that would just infinitely damage your tower because it didn't even degenerate health. And you couldn't remove it with the spell that cost the same elixir. You would have to use something stronger, like maybe a fireball, which doesn't feel good when you have to kill a princess with
and on top of that, this is crazy to think about. At the launch of Legendaries, they went up to level 6. If you remember that. They went up to level 6, but Commons only went up to level 12. Level 12 arrows didn't kill a level 6 princess either. So whether you were in tournaments or the top of the ladder, it was pretty unbelievable to fight a princess. Her release date was really good. It's funny because they say that legendaries never get nerfed, but the very first change ever made to a legendary was a significant nerf to princess. And even despite this nerf, she goes on to be one of the most powerful meta-defining cards pretty much since her release. So while this was great in terms of balancing competitive play, boy, Princess was still a tier 1 card.
And then moving down to the Ice Wizard, which is kind of pushing in the opposite direction. The Ice Wizard gets a slight damage increase. Now, for me personally, and maybe you have some more insight into this, for me personally, the Ice Wizard getting a little bit more damage, I guess it's nice, but I never really saw the Ice Wizard as a damaging card.
No, I mean, even if you did the math on it at the time, this worked out to like 3 damage per attack or like 6 damage per attacker. It was very, very insignificant. And now we move on to two handsome men very close to my heart. I love princes. Dark Prince, regular Prince, they're all my favorite. But at the time, you can see that Prince was actually a huge dominant part of the meta. And this was part of the Prince double P.E.K.K.A deck that existed. But even if you didn't have a lot of legendaries and a lot of high up epics, Prince was very popular because it's one of the 4 epics that you can start the game off with. As you can see from the patch notes, Prince was the most used card in the game. But like Tesla Tower, the stats didn't really seem to say that it was overpowered. What Supercell wanted to nerf here was giving the opponents a little bit of a larger time window to react to a charging Prince. Sometimes you'd have the Prince and Dark Prince, they get played, they start charging right away, and they move so fast that you didn't have time even to regenerate that elixir to defend with. And this isn't a hugely significant speed nerf. You could definitely notice it, but I think what this did was allow just that little extra window of opportunity to play your cards in front of the Prince or distract them or freeze them or whatever. It didn't really lower the power level of the Prince double P.E.K.K.A deck at all. It still remained a very powerful deck, but I think this was a great change because you always want your powerful cards to have some amount of counterplay to it, and if things move too fast, if you don't even have a reaction time for it.
Valkyrie was one of the cards that I almost feel like was like a submarine. Like, people didn't really play it or use it. It was just not really that great.
It was really forgotten about. I mean, early on in the game, when everyone's kind of in Arena 2 and 3, she was pretty popular because Witch was popular, right? It's a good card to counter Skeleton Army and Witch and some of those other cards. But very quickly she dropped off. And it's funny because Valkyrie is such a key part of the metagame now that it's weird to think that she didn't exist in the metagame. Like, might as well have not been played. And this is probably the single largest, or one of the single largest buffs ever given to a card.
And I don't even think the community realized how big of a change this would have made to the card, because it's basically increasing the strength of the card by a level's worth at all stages. So the Valkyrie becomes going from one of the cards that is least used to a staple card that is a great all-round 4-cost a card to play in a deck. And
it took a while to catch on. I mean, I remember when they announced this patch, people in the general community reaction wasn't like, holy crap, Valkyrie's nuts now. It was like, oh, I like Valkyrie, I'm glad that she's getting a buff. Maybe I'll try her out after this, right? Like, it was very like, well, this might be all right. I don't think people understand how much of a difference 10% hit point damage could make, but we'd never make that mistake again as a community, because after this change, I'd say it took a little bit to catch on, but once she caught on, boom, it was all over the place. Valkyrie became a key factor in what became known as the trifecta deck, the Hog, Valkyrie, Musketeer, with another late bloomer in Musketeer, right? And she was only nerfed or buffed a few episodes ago. So, yeah, this was probably one of the most impactful, significant changes to the tournament meta, because it took a card that effectively didn't exist and brought it up into that A tier, which is what you want out of balance updates.
Absolutely.
So, since we were just talking about the Valkyrie, this is statistically probably the second or third biggest buff ever received by a single card. But unlike the Valkyrie, where the 10% hit point damage vaulted her into playability, you'd think this would be a massive change. 20% damage, whoa! But kind of like the Ice Wizard change, his damage and DPS really wasn't that high. Even, later on, it's really not that high overall. And this didn't do much. I mean, his use rates are really low, his win rates are really low. It says in the patch notes he's very clearly underpowered. It's pretty hard to underdo it with a 20% damage increase. That's a huge buff, but it didn't actually change the Royal Giant at all, because he still fundamentally didn't outrange Tesla Towers, Inferno Towers, cannons. He had to take just that many more steps towards a tower, which lets you get shot a few more times. It doesn't protect the things behind him that well. This was a big change that a lot of people were hoping would increase Royal Giant's viability, but they'd have to wait until the May patch for really what brought Royal Giant up to the tournament forefront.
Absolutely. A lot of the game's strong decks and really, really meta cards were taken off of TV Royale, which at this time featured the top of the ladder, the top players playing Legendary Arenas, the guys that are playing at max card levels, max player levels.
TV Royale only. There wasn't a TV Royale for every arena yet. TV Royale was only the top 50 players. So you got a very narrow view of what the metagame was.
And why that's so important is because then everybody sees P.E.K.K.A as a card to play. So this giant buff is actually incredibly interesting, because they wanted people to have a place for the giant to be played. They wanted to incentivize people to play the giant. What we will actually find out, because, man, and you're going to have to correct me on this if I'm wrong, but This is pretty much the only change for the Giant that happens in a long time.
Ever, yeah.
And
the entire history of the game.
the Giant goes from a card that is, without any changes, it goes from a card that is kind of not really used, the P.E.K.K.A is kind of the go-to big body, to like incredibly successful. Very, very successful in many ways.
Pretty quick little buff actually to Rage. Rage is one of the most underplayed cards. I mean, even today at the time we're recording this video, it's not a very popular card. But I think this is a very good buff because one of the problems with Rage, it used to last a much longer period of time, but you don't really care about it for a 15-second period, right? You just need it to change the combat right now, right then. Like, it's very often just to see an empty Rage pool. So by shortening the duration but increasing the buff, I think this was overall an improvement to the card, but ultimately it didn't really change the effectiveness or the playability of the Rage card.
The poison damage buff was interesting because it brought it pretty much in line with Fireball. Now the only real difference is that poison lasts over kind of a long duration of time, whereas Fireball is an instant effect. And I think one of the things about poison we talked about when we were talking about when it was released was that players didn't have a lot of time to experiment and investigate the card a lot, and they needed the time to be able to do that. On top of the fact that it was an epic, which we know are the most difficult cards to obtain, I think it took a really long while for poison to kind of have its place, and I think this damage buff, actually in my eyes, wasn't over necessary. But it's interesting because people will start playing with this card more and discover that there's a lot of fantastic uses for it.
I think you nailed it with the epics. I mean, if I have a level 7 Fireball, or level 6, which is the tournament cap for that time, right? Yeah. And I only have a level 1 or 2 Poison, it's just worse even with the damage buff because it's just not the same level. But yeah, once this goes in, I would say around the Helsinki tournament, which 3 weeks from now was the first time I remember being like, this Poison card, it made a very big impact in tournaments. In the future, I think this was actually kind of the perfect buff because I think Poison and Fireball being about equal feels good. This mirror change, so legendary cards are mirrored one level lower. So this is actually another one of those things that you could tell Supercell was struggling with the relative card levels of their rarities. Does a level 1 legendary equal a level 8 common or a level 9 common is it later? Is it a level 3 epic or level 4 epic? At the time, mirror was mirroring at the existing tournament cap, which meant that a level 3 mirror made a level 1 legendary. And actually level 1 and 2 mirrors would also make level 1 legendaries. But the problem was that if you had, let's say, like a level 7 mirror, it was making a level 4 legendary, and that was actually usually pretty high relative to what people actually had in legendaries. It was pretty common for you to be able to mirror a legendary higher than your actual legendary card, even if your mirror itself was kind of under-leveled. So this is just more of that back and forth tension. It's all resolved in the May 3rd update, where they go ahead and say, here's the new tournament levels, and then here is level 13 commons and level 11 rares. It all gets sorted out then, but these are the kind of changes along with like the witches getting their skeletons reduced and some of those other changes that you can just tell are the tension trying to get those card levels to even out.
The Three Musketeers change is very interesting in my eyes because Three Musketeers is kind of 4 costs for each. They actually don't lose any kind of strength. They're played at level. So each of the Musketeers is 4 costs and you're getting it for 10, so it's 10 for 12 essentially, and they changed it to be 9 for 12, so you got more efficiency out of it. After this change, it takes a long while for Three Musketeers to really be played in a not gimmicky fashion. A lot of the Three Musketeers played soon after this change, and up to this point were really in decks that were trying to catch you by surprise and kind of get you to like be off balance and take down a tower really quick. But it takes a long time for people to actually play Three Musketeers and use them with great finesse and control and be really good at it. One of the reasons I think is just kind of discovering this whole idea of splitting is one part, and then the second part, which I think is much more important, is that as the game progresses, they start adding 1 elixir, 2 elixir cost cards, and also more legendaries that kind of are low cost and incredibly effective for the elixir that they cost. And so having that elixir cost reduced to 9 and not being able to be caught with your pants down, so to speak, once you play them, I think is a very important dynamic that helped the Three Musketeer card a lot.
Yeah, like as from a player standpoint, just even understanding that I'm getting 3 Musketeers for 3 each instead of 4 each makes you go like, oh, it's kind of a good value. But you're right. While they do see some fringe play after this change, it's certainly a much better value. It's not really until the next game update where fire spirits and guards and miner enter the game, that you start to see a sort of critical mass of cheap supporting cards that allow you to defend your Three Musketeers. This is a very minor quality of life change. Archers are less popular than Spear Goblins at the time. Actually, Spear Goblins were a card that's kind of weird. With no changes, they went from being very, very popular early in the game's lifespan to being far less popular as the game went on, which is unfortunate because those guys, they work hard. But Archers were pretty much the unfavorable ranged unit. You either had Spear Goblins or Musketeer. One of the reasons why is that when Archers would reach something, they would actually stop and do their full animation. Unlike the other ones that fire as soon as something walks into their range, this change just brings them in line with the rest. So now as soon as something walks into an archer range, they fire off that first shot and then start the wind up. This is a good change. It actually, archers were a part of the Helsinki winning deck, so you can't say that they weren't played at all or they weren't that good. But overall, I don't think that this ever really thrust archers into the spotlight.
Yeah, I would agree. The balloon change is actually really interesting just because it seems very small, but the balloon has a lot of hit points, so a 5% increase is actually pretty large. The card is binary, and what that means is just that it either gives you your value by getting to the building and dropping a bomb, or it dies before it reaches the building and you get nothing.
Right. I mean, it's such a hit or miss card, right? Like, it either drops one bomb and it's worth its 5 elixir cost, or it dies shortly before the tower and you just hate yourself. So 5% hit point increase on a relatively large health pool. I mean, it's something like 1,200, 1,300, whatever. Worked out to about 2 to 3 tower shots, which is the difference often between between making it and not. And the running joke of the history of the meta series, last and least, here comes the witch with yet another buff that does nothing. So 5% damage increase. If you remember from the last update, she got, I think, a 3% damage increase. So clearly the Clash Royale team thought that witch was like close to being good. Like, they didn't want to over buff her. They didn't want to give her the Royal Giant like 20% buff or anything. So they give her these little changes, and it's still just not there. It's not enough even after this change to make Witch see a lot of play. The thing that really kills it too is that in the next update, when they add level 11 rares and level 13 commons, level 8 Epic Witch stays the exact same, and she falls even further behind after this next update. Witch, really fun card, really flavorful, does a lot of cool stuff, really has been struggling to find her place in the meta despite countless buffs and buffs and buffs to her abilities.
So that wraps up history of the meta number 8. Lots of changes, lots of little things that Supercell is adjusting after the launch of the game. So many players are getting into Clash Royale and trying to experiment and play and figure out what's really working for them. And really interested to see the next episode of the history of the meta series, because that's where we get into the first big tournament that Supercell will run, the Helsinki Tour, which will change the landscape of the game in a meaningful way. So if you guys want to catch that, make sure you follow our YouTube, our Twitch, and our Twitter to keep up to date with the Super Magical Cup content that we are throwing at you. And with that, Rumham and I will be signing out. See you at the next video.